It's attaching to me, deeper than before. Why does it take me there? Is it a dream? Each shift twists me inside. Like a puzzle, the armor is adapting. But do I? Let's see what happens in the next jump. If this blended reality improves, or still a soup of blurs and visions. Blinding light flashed as plasma bolts seared through the air, striking dunes and sending molten sand spraying in every direction. Miles Hayden ducked behind a jagged outcrop, the adaptive armor shifting to absorb heat and deflect incoming fire. The howling wind of the sandstorm added chaos, limiting visibility to only a few feet. His attackers, a band of scavengers draped in patchwork armor and wielding alien rifles, moved in tighter formations, their glowing visors cutting through the storm. "Hayden!" one shouted through a modulated amplifier. "We know what you're carrying. Hand over the armor, and you might live." Miles smirked, brushing sand from the glowing plates of his chest piece. "You'd have to pry it off my corpse, but something tells me you're not up to the task." He raised his hand, and the armor responded with a pulse of energy that scattered the nearest attackers, their weapons flying from their grips. Miles sprang forward, using the storm as cover. The armor's enhanced strength turned his punches into devastating blows, dropping two scavengers before they could react. The storm intensified, whipping sand in every direction. Miles pressed onward, hearing the hum of engines in the distance. The scavengers' reinforcements were closing in, a convoy of skimmers bristling with mounted guns. He scanned for an escape, but his visor picked up something unusual. Beneath the dunes, a faint energy signature pulsed in rhythmic intervals, unlike anything he'd encountered before. "What the hell is that?" Miles muttered, ducking as another plasma bolt whizzed past his ear. The ground beneath him trembled, and a section of the sand collapsed, revealing a metallic structure buried in the earth. Ancient, angular, and humming with power, it radiated a faint glow that cut through the storm. The scavengers hesitated, murmuring to one another as they noticed the artifact. Miles took the opportunity to dive into the exposed pit. Sliding down the steep sandbank, he landed hard on the metallic surface. The artifact was massive, stretching out like the ribcage of some long-dead titan, its surfaces inscribed with alien glyphs that glowed faintly. As he touched it, his armor vibrated in response, syncing with the artifact's energy. Then he saw her. The ground trembled again, and in the flickering light of the artifact, he saw her, half buried in debris. Miles approached cautiously, the glow of the artifact casting long shadows across the chamber. She wasn't like anything he had seen before. Her skin shimmered with a faint iridescence, catching the light in hues of violet and silver. Her features were humanoid, but otherworldly, angled, elegant, and sharp, yet fragile. One of her arms was pinned under a jagged piece of alien metal, and her eyes fluttered weakly, their faint glow pulsing in time with the artifact's hum. "Hey," Miles said softly, unsure if she could understand him. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened fully, locking onto his. For a moment, he felt a surge of recognition, as if her gaze pierced through his mind and read his thoughts. Her lips moved, but the words were garbled, a mixture of melodic tones and static, like a broken signal. She struggled weakly, trying to free herself, but the debris held her firm. Miles knelt beside her, inspecting the situation. The metal pinning her down was fused with the floor, pulsing with the same energy that radiated through the chamber. Carefully, he placed his hands on the jagged edge, his armor shifting and glowing as it adapted to the material. With a grunt, he lifted the debris, tossing it aside. The woman gasped, clutching her freed arm as she sat up. "You freed me," she said haltingly, her voice carrying an unearthly melody but clear enough to understand. Miles raised an eyebrow. "You speak English?" Her head tilted, her shimmering hair falling over her shoulders. "Your language is primitive, but the artifact translates." She winced, clutching her side. Miles reached out instinctively, but she flinched back, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. Why are you here? I could ask you the same thing, Miles replied. This thing, he gestured to the artifact, dragged me down here. What is it, and who are you? She hesitated, her gaze darting between him and the glowing structure. I am Zira, she said finally. This artifact, it is not meant for your kind. You should not have touched it. Yeah, well, it didn't exactly give me a choice, Miles shot back, crossing his arms. So how about you explain what's going on before more scavengers show up? Zira's expression softened, her tension easing slightly. This is a Nexus Core, she explained, her voice steadying. A remnant of an ancient network that once connected countless worlds. It holds knowledge, power, and danger. My people were its guardians, but we lost control of it long ago. Miles frowned, his eyes flicking to the glowing glyphs around them. So what? It's just been sitting here under the sand waiting for someone to find it? No, Zira said, shaking her head. It's been waiting for someone worthy. Her words hung in the air, the hum of the artifact growing louder, as if in response. Miles felt a chill run down his spine. And you think that's me? He asked skeptically. Zira didn't answer. Instead, she stood slowly, her movements still cautious but gaining strength. If the artifact bonded with you, it means you are linked to it now, and if you are linked, then we are running out of time. Time for what? Miles pressed, but Zira's attention was already on the artifact. She reached out, her hand hovering over one of the glowing glyphs. The room shuddered as the glyph brightened, and a series of symbols projected into the air, spinning and shifting like a puzzle being solved. Zira's face darkened. It's activating. Before Miles could respond, the chamber's walls began to shift, panels sliding away to reveal corridors glowing with the same alien light. A distant rumble echoed through the tunnels, and the storm above seemed to grow more intense. We need to move, Zira said firmly. If the scavengers find us here, they'll kill us both and destroy what remains of the Nexus. Miles sighed, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run in the opposite direction. But something about Zira, about the artifact, told him this wasn't something he could walk away from. Fine, he said, gripping the glowing edges of his armor as it adjusted to the changing environment. But you'd better start talking on the way. As they headed into the maze of glowing corridors, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact had more in store for him than he was ready to handle. And Zira, she clearly wasn't telling him everything. The corridors stretched endlessly, glowing glyphs pulsating like a heartbeat, lighting their path. Miles's footsteps echoed, a stark contrast to Zira's almost silent movements. You said this thing bonded with me. Why me? Miles's voice carried frustration and curiosity. Zira glanced at him, her expression unreadable. The Nexus doesn't choose lightly. It senses something within you, something your people might not even see. Miles smirked bitterly. Yeah? And what's that? My charming personality? Zira stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face him. It's not a joke. The Nexus responds to potential. You might not believe it, but it saw something different. Miles gestured around at the glowing walls. Different? Try inconvenient. Ever since I touched that thing, scavengers have been gunning for me, and now I'm babysitting you. Zira's gaze hardened, and she stepped closer. You don't understand, do you? The Nexus isn't just a relic. It's alive. It carries the history of 1,000 civilizations, and it won't just let anyone access its power. If you're linked to it, you're already a target, for enemies far worse than scavengers. Miles sighed, his sarcasm fading. Fine. So what do we do? Zira turned and began walking again, her voice quieter but no less urgent. We find the core chamber. If the Nexus fully activates without guidance, it could destabilize the entire region, maybe more. Destabilize? Miles asked, quickening his pace to match hers. You mean blow up? Not exactly, Zira said, her tone grim. The Nexus doesn't destroy, it consumes. Entire cities, entire worlds. It takes them apart piece by piece, integrating them into its network. Miles shook his head, a grim laugh escaping him. Great. So now I'm tied to a planet-eating superweapon. It's not a weapon, Zira snapped, her voice sharp. It's a legacy. My people once guided it, used it to connect and protect. But we failed, and if we don't stop it now, your world will pay the price. Before Miles could respond, the ground shook violently, sending him stumbling. A deafening roar echoed through the corridors, followed by distant crashes. What the hell was that? He asked, his armor stabilizing him as he drew his weapon. Zira's expression darkened. The scavengers. They've found a way in. As if on cue, the distant sounds of shouting and clanging metal grew louder. Shadows flickered at the far end of the corridor, and the glow of plasma weapons illuminated the walls. Miles gritted his teeth. Looks like we're not alone. Zira stepped closer to the glyphs on the wall, her hand hovering over them as they began to glow more brightly. The Nexus might help us, but only if I can access its defenses. Miles raised his weapon, stepping between her and the incoming shadows. Then you'd better work fast. The first wave of scavengers rounded the corner, their makeshift armor glinting in the light. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, forcing Miles to dive for cover. His adaptive armor absorbed the brunt of a near hit, flaring with energy as it redirected the impact. He returned fire, his weapon glowing with a blue charge, sending a bolt that ricocheted through the group. "Zira!" he shouted over the chaos. "Any day now." "I need time," she yelled back, her focus entirely on the glyphs. They shifted and pulsed under her hands, forming patterns that glowed brighter with each second. The scavengers pressed forward, their leader barking orders. Miles ducked behind a fallen piece of the corridor wall, popping up to fire another shot. Time's a luxury we don't have. Suddenly, the corridor walls flared to life, beams of golden energy shooting out and slicing through the scavenger ranks. The attackers screamed as they were thrown back, their weapons clattering to the floor. Miles stared in disbelief as the walls pulsed with power, the glyphs glowing like embers. Zira turned, her face pale but determined. The Nexus is responding, but it won't hold them off forever. We need to keep moving. Miles nodded, his weapon still raised as he scanned the now empty corridor. Lead the way. As they moved deeper into the Nexus, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact wasn't just alive. It was watching him, and somehow he knew their journey was far from over. Miles and Zira navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the Nexus Core, the alien glyphs glowing brighter with every step. The energy within the walls pulsed like a heartbeat, and Miles couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact was alive, watching their every move. Zira's demeanor was tense, her sharp gaze darting between the symbols on the walls, her lips moving as if she were silently decoding an ancient language. "What is this place, really?" Miles asked, his voice echoing in the chamber. Zira hesitated, then spoke. "It's more than a nexus, it's a key, a gateway to something far greater. My people were its guardians, but they failed to control its power. If it fully activates, it could destroy worlds." Miles stopped in his tracks, the weight of her words sinking in. "And I'm supposed to just trust you? You've been holding back this whole time." Zira turned to face him, her iridescent eyes narrowing. "You don't have a choice. If we don't stop it, those scavengers won't just loot this place. They'll unleash something far worse than you or I can imagine." Before Miles could respond, a deafening roar reverberated through the corridors. The glyphs on the walls shifted, rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle, and the floor beneath them trembled. Miles instinctively activated his armor's stabilizers, while Zira clung to the wall for support. "What now?" Miles growled, scanning their surroundings. Zira's eyes widened as she pointed ahead. "The Nexus is awakening. It's testing you." The corridor ahead morphed into a blinding tunnel of light, and suddenly they were no longer in the Nexus. Miles found himself standing in an endless desert under a crimson sky, the air heavy with the scent of sulfur. Beside him, Zira looked equally disoriented, her shimmering form flickering like a glitch in a simulation. "This isn't real," Zira murmured, her voice barely audible. Miles raised his hand, his armor reacting to the environment. "Then what is it?" Before Zira could answer, a massive, clawed beast emerged from the shifting sands, its eyes glowing with the same energy as the Nexus glyphs. The creature roared, its jaws snapping inches from Miles as he rolled out of the way. "It's a manifestation," Zira said, her voice urgent. "The Nexus is testing your resolve. If you fail, we die here." Miles gritted his teeth, activating the full power of his armor. Energy coursed through his limbs as he lunged at the beast, his movements a blur. The clash was violent, every strike of his enhanced fists sending shockwaves through the desert. Zira, meanwhile, focused on the glyphs that appeared mid-air, deciphering their meaning as quickly as she could. "Miles, the core. Aim for the core beneath its chest." Miles adjusted his stance, his mind racing. The beast's movements were erratic, its claws swiping with terrifying speed. But then he saw it. A faint glow beneath the creature's armored hide. With a roar of his own, Miles leapt, his armor amplifying his strength as he drove a glowing blade into the beast's core. The creature let out a final piercing cry before disintegrating into a cloud of light. As the desert dissolved around them, Miles and Zira found themselves back in the Nexus, the glyphs on the walls, now pulsing rhythmically. Zira looked at Miles, her expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You passed." "Passed what?" Miles asked, his voice edged with frustration. Zira smiled faintly. "The first test. But this is far from over. The Nexus has more to reveal, and it won't be easy." Miles sighed, shaking his head. "Figures. Let's get this over with." As they ventured deeper into the Nexus, the glyphs began to shift again, hinting at challenges yet to come. The connection between Miles and the artifact grew stronger, and he couldn't ignore the sense that his role in this was far more significant than he had ever imagined.